Okay, create a little intro here. Okay, recreating the American Longhunter by Joseph Ruckman. I actually read this 10 years ago, and I'd been looking for it, found it, did it again. You know, I got it on video here, reading it out loud. This isn't for everyone. This is for someone who is. It's this guy's perspective. On what the American Longhunter wore, what he did, horses or no horses, all this kind of stuff, logistics and all this kind of thing. But for someone, I knew they do this a lot back east, where they do the reenactments. And if you're someone that wanted to do a reenactment or to create a persona and then partake in these things, that's what this book is for. If you're someone who's interested in that, or if you just want to pick up some this guy's perspective on the Longhunter. I thought it was really entertaining, but it's just not for everyone. So I'll make sure I got this in the title so someone will be looking for this kind of thing. But I found it to be very entertaining. Recreating the American Longhunter. Introduction. As the title implies, this book was written for those who are looking for some guidelines in what the 18th century Longhunter looked like and the type of equipment he used, with an eye toward reproducing it. But rather than limit the reader to appearances, I hope to encourage those who wish to do so to go beyond being 21st century men, and in some cases women, wearing funny clothes and shooting old-fashioned guns, and move into the realm of creating their own 18th century character, sometimes called a persona, with a unique history and identity of their own. There's a group on Facebook that does this. A lot of people that do what do they call it, reenactments. I know they do a lot of this on the East Coast, and there's people that want to know how to do this correctly. Why would you want to do so is a question that is difficult to answer. I suppose it has to do with authenticity. Anyone can assemble a hodgepodge of gear and clothing and go out and play Longhunter. It's quite a different matter to develop a separate entity with a life, appearance, and history of one's own that could have stepped out of the past. That sounds very cool. You may have already begun doing so without realizing it, explaining, either to yourself or others, why you wear certain articles of clothing or carry certain pieces of equipment. Sometimes this may be a means to defend yourself from those who tell you something, from those who tell you something you are wearing isn't correct. But eventually you may find yourself wondering who you are, where you came from, and where you are going. These are questions that I hope you will ask yourself, and hope this book will help you to find the answers. Recreating history is almost always romantic in nature, a longing for times when life was simpler and people were better. Unfortunately, sometimes did not really exist. Unfortunately, such times did not really exist. Life was not simpler. It is our narrow view of life that simplifies its complexity. Great point. People were certainly different, but not necessarily better. They were quite capable of acts that, from a modern perspective, seem senselessly cruel, but to them were quite necessary, even desirable. What I hope to do is to strip away some of our romantic notions about these people and present a clear picture of what they were really like. The biggest problem with the information we have on these men is that so little of it is firsthand. Add to this the fact that much of the primary documentation on these men is from observers who held them in contempt for their being hardly 1 degree removed from the Indians. Who were also held in contempt. What remains is at best a distorted image. This image is further distorted by the many books of romantic fiction written over the course of the last 2 centuries, of which I consider James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans, and the rest of the leather-stocking tales to be the worst offender. These works of fiction I find damaging because I have found that the information in them is retained long after its fictional origin is forgotten. He's saying Last of the Mohicans is not necessarily correct. To clarify the image of the Longhunter somewhat, I have limited myself to either primary first-hand sources or to secondary sources that quote primary sources. However, even given good first-hand information, there are two major obstacles to interpreting it that cannot be overcome by merely gathering more facts. The most significant problem is that of language. While the English language has not changed dramatically in 200 years, there are some nuances that require common sense to overcome, and others which require some degree of research. For example, an 18th century description of a tomahawk describes it as being a hammer at one side and a sharp hatchet at the other. I have illustrated one way this can be interpreted. While this interpretation is laughable to most of us, it does fit the description. You'll see there, he's got a tomahawk with a hammer at the end over here instead of on the other end of the blade. That does fit the description. Nonetheless, I have deliberately limited my use of illustrations, as feel that the written word is the most pure research tool available to the novice. The proper documentation of artifacts is beyond most of us, leaving us at the mercy of experts, in quotes, and frankly, I've seen quite enough 18th century artifacts of 20th century construction that have fooled the experts. Those illustrations I use are not offered as models to be replicated, but are simply intended to serve as examples of what I believe represent or clarify the primary documentation. The second, and possibly the more difficult obstacle to overcome in interpretation, is that of values. And looking back at 18th century people, it is difficult to understand them unless we can manage to keep from imposing our 21st century values on them. Their point of view was different, and we can't possibly hope to understand the people unless we understand their situation from their perspective. Rather than attempt to outline some generic set of 18th century American values, at which I have no doubt I should fill, I shall tackle the differences between 18th and 21st century as the need arises. To give you an example, while in colonial Williamsburg, I observed a young man pick up a replica of a toy lamb with wheels and remarked to his companion, "Must have been an exciting life. Can you imagine playing with this all day?" He obviously did not understand that 18th century children seldom had the opportunity to play at all unless you consider making a game out of some sort of aspect of work a form of play. The young man was opposing a modern concept of leisure time where it simply isn't appropriate. There were very few idle moments for the children or the adults of 200 years ago, and the amount of leisure time we consider necessary would be unthinkable to them. What they would think of our spending this veritable wealth of free time trying to relive their existence, I don't know. I'm afraid I can guess, though. I think I'm going to leave it right there. It's not chapters, but that's a chapter. Anyhow, see you in the next part. Love you. God bless.